All right, on your blackboard, if you get on there, your exam scores are up there. There was one from West Sabine. Hannah, I didn't get your test till this morning, so yours hasn't been graded yet, but I'll get it graded today. So the rest of you should be up there. I've also put an average column in there so you can see exactly how you're doing in the class. If you've got a problem with something, let me know. I'll be glad to help you. If you need something explained to you, I will. Don't forget, you don't have much time left on that research paper coming up, okay? If you have not started on the research paper, you're about 2 weeks late now, so get started. It's not an easy project, okay? All right, so we're going to move into the next section, and we're going to talk a little bit about the age of reform. This one's a little different than the other lectures. It's not going to be nearly as political as what we've seen before. What we're going to deal with is the fact that in this time period that kind of overlaps with the age of Jackson, it's roughly 1820 to 1860. That's kind of the period we're talking about here. We're going to talk about the social things that happen in this, because this was a time of great and significant change in our government. There we go. It was a time period of a lot of denominational diversity, particularly in Christendom. We've already kind of talked about deism earlier in a pretty vague sense. We talked about how Jefferson was a deist. But this is kind of the golden age of deism. If you don't know what that means, a deity is a god. Well, what deists believe is that God created the world, but then he no longer intervened in it. The example that's usually given to explain is you think of God as a clockmaker. A clockmaker spends a lot of time building this clock that works, and he puts all the parts in, and he winds it up, and he makes sure everything works right. But then he gives you the clock. He doesn't come back by your house every 15 minutes and check to make sure the clock's running well. Okay? Well, that's kind of what God is to these people. He created everything, but then he just left it alone. It was a very scientific approach to Christianity. Okay? There was also the idea of Unitarianism, which is still around today. Unitarianism does not recognize the Trinity. They don't recognize God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There is only God. This is also greatly respected by the scientific minds of the time. This is kind of the height of the scientific revolution we're talking about here. People were really starting to understand science. And this appeals to rationalists. It appeals to men of science, because there's lots of free will in this. Instead of Calvinism, remember the belief under Calvin was that everything was preordained, that God was omnipotent and he preordained the way everything was going to turn out. Well, these guys would say, no, a loving God invented the world, a loving God created all this, but then he gave mankind free will to make their choices. We got on finally. It just finally connected. Yeah, right. Thank you.
Good deal.
The next group I want to talk to you about are the Millerites. They're still around, although they call themselves Adventists today. But the Millerites, they grew out of a belief that you could add up the ages of the apostles and figure out the age of the earth. And then you could carefully read the Old Testament and find hints in it of when the last days were going to be. And through carefully calculating this, you could predict when Christ was going to return. And they predicted that Christ was going to return on October 22nd of 1844. Down to the day. They sold Advent robes, these white robes that people could wear. And people gathered them, bought them all over the country. And on October 22nd of 1844, they gathered on hilltops all around the country, dressed in their white, either called Advent robes or Ascension robes, because they believed that they would be carried bodily into heaven when Christ was returned. The saved would be bodily carried up without dying. You can imagine when it didn't happen the next day that they're going to have some issues, right? One might think that the religion would fall apart here. It didn't. Instead, they said there was a problem with the math, and they recalculated, and they picked a later date, sold some more robes. They did this about 4 times. Just kept recalculating the date. Eventually, that religion breaks with that part of the belief, and it becomes more mainstream Christianity. Okay, so the Adventists that are out today, while they came out of the Millerite movement, they don't have the same beliefs. There's something a little bit different. And then the Methodists and the Presbyterians split over the issue of slavery. You had the question of whether slavery was supported. And generally speaking, the Methodists were pro-slavery, the Presbyterians were anti-slavery. Although that's not always true by any stretch of the imagination. But generally speaking, that's the direction things fell. This is also kind of the heyday of the Mormon movement. Now, the Mormon church grows out of the philosophies and the understandings of Joseph Smith. The Mormon movement is still a powerful faith today. You've heard of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's the Mormon church. They have let go of some of the beliefs that we're going to talk about today, so just kind of so everybody's aware. It is also the fastest growing religion in the United States today. So it's a religion that's growing very, very quickly. Joseph Smith was an interesting character. He had been in and out of jail several times in his younger life. He was a bit of a traveling salesman, a bit of a con artist sometimes, and admitted it so. Admitted that he'd done this stuff when he was younger. But at a point in his life, Joseph Smith reports that he is visited by the archangel Moroni. And the archangel presents him the Book of Mormon, which is another testament of the book of Jesus Christ. And what this book is supposed to say is that when Jesus died, he didn't just rise again once. He rose again twice. He rose again once in Israel, but then he rose again in the Americas and presented the good word to the American Indians. Was bringing Christianity to America. Later on, they're going to believe that the Indians are the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is going to develop from this. He's going to have a lot of issues because one of the key beliefs of the Mormon movement at this time period, one that they no longer accept today. I want to be clear, modern Mormons do not accept this. Primitive Mormons do. But was the idea of polygamy, or having multiple wives. Men were permitted to have as many wives as they could afford. Women were only permitted to have one husband. Now, why is that? That's an interesting story to tell. The justification for this was a careful reading of the Old Testament and the poetry in I believe it's the Book of Solomon. Talks about something called a well of souls. And Joseph Smith believes that all the souls that are ever going to be created are in the well of souls. And when you're born, one of these souls comes out and goes into your body. And Jesus will return when the well of souls is empty. Now, to do that, if your goal as a Christian is to bring about the return of Jesus and that second kingdom as fast as possible, what you should do is have as many kids as you can so you can dump that well faster. So the best way to do that is for men to have multiple wives. It allows them to have more children. Okay? That's why women couldn't have more than one husband. That doesn't help have more kids. Having more than one husband does not make you able to have more than one kid a year. Okay? However, a man could have as many as he wanted to, as long as he has that many wives. That's the justification behind it. Again, not something that the church accepts anymore. Joseph Smith and his church are chased out of New York. They end up going into Missouri, where they found something called the Nauvoo Legion. He was like his personal army. He's eventually killed in Missouri. And his church is taken over by his first disciple, Brigham Young, who leads the people out of Missouri and eventually settles in Salt Lake City, Utah, where Brigham Young University is today. Still the largest amount of Mormons in the country live in Utah. A lot in Nevada too. So the Mormon movement was really, really big. But guys, it wasn't loved by Americans. They were literally shot at and ran out of states. They were ran out of New York. They went through Illinois. They were ran out of there. They went through Missouri. They were ran out of there. They kept getting chased out of places because their beliefs were not basic and fundamental to most forms of Christianity. Okay? I know I'm going quick through this, but it's not as exciting as stuff as I would like it to be. The Shakers are another religion that until very recently was still around. The last Shaker died just a few years ago. She was 100 and something years old. It was founded by a lady named Mother Ann Lee. And the Shakers believed that the end of the world was imminent. The world was going to end very soon. And their version of the end of the world, while Christ was going to come, it was a much more violent version. They believed that there would be war, there would be disease that would wipe out. All this would happen, all these terrible things would happen before Christ returned. And since the world was ending, and there's going to be all this treachery, they didn't think it was a good idea to bring children into the world because these children were going to live in this terrible world. So this religion taught an absolute separation of the sexes. Men and women never mixed.
So how did they expect for it to...
There's the issue, which is why there are no Shakers anymore. If you weren't listening, she asked, how did they expect it to spread? Well, it didn't. There were converts early on because they were afraid of this imminent war, this imminent revolution. But those converts did not reproduce, and the single best way for a religion to spread is through reproduction. Most people are the religion of the parents, okay? But they taught absolute separation of the sexes. Men and women were never together. There was no need for it. These guys are famous for one thing. Anybody know what they're famous for? You ever heard of Shaker furniture? Some of the most beautiful furniture you'll ever see was made by these tradesmen, the Shaker furniture. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. Look it up someday if you're interested. That's Mother Ann Lee up there. There were also these ideal communities, which are kind of predecessors to the communes of the 1960s. There was a couple of these, and the names may sound familiar to you. The Amana community and the Oneida community. You don't know them as communities, but you've probably seen Amana before. Amana makes a lot of toasters and refrigerators and stuff like that. It's a big corporation now. And Oneida makes T-shirts and silverware and stuff. You might have seen Oneida on the back of your T-shirts, a big T-shirt manufacturer. That's a corporation. But these corporations used to be religious communities. And both of these communities, the Amana community was founded by Christian Metz, and the Oneida community by John Noyes. Both of these were, and forgive me guys for being a bit crass, but this is a college class and we have to deal with things sometimes. These were free love communities. Okay? Everybody was having sex with everybody. And that was kind of the belief of these communities, that they actually believed that marriage was kind of a form of slavery. That if a female promises to love, honor, and obey her husband, that's the same thing as being a slave to them. Women should be free, should be free sexually, just like men are. And it was kind of a revolutionary idea. And these communities came together, and while they would marry, their marriages were largely economic things. They were, about business and having kids, and they did do that and raise kids together. But they were a free love community. You can imagine they don't last long as a community. There was lots of infighting. Very quickly, we had lots and lots of duels and stuff happening. You can imagine, I don't know, ladies, if you think about your boyfriend, or guys, think about yourself, you can imagine how angry you would get, okay? So lots and lots of violence in these communities. This is also kind of the glory days of transcendentalism. The 1860s always feel like the 1960s to me, because lots of peace, love, happiness, and free love, man. That's kind of the feeling that you have in this time period. These guys here, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, they were hippies before there were hippies. Okay? These were guys that valued nature and going and living and communing with nature over everything else. They wrote beautiful books about it. And go read On Walden Pond or On Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau, where they went out and lived a solitary lifestyle, a simple life in the woods, separate from others. And all they did was kind of philosophize on how important it was for man to be good to other men. We should be our brother's keeper. We should care for each other. Henry David Thoreau goes so far to talk in a book called On Civil Disobedience that one of your responsibilities, and this is a transcendentalist idea, one of your responsibilities is if you see something being done that's unjust to your neighbor, you should disobey the law that makes that happen. Civil disobedience. Do not obey an unjust law. He believed it so much that when the Mexican War broke out, and we're going to study that in the next lecture, but when the Mexican War broke out, he refused to pay his taxes because he didn't want any of his money going to buy bullets to kill his fellow men. By the way, he wrote that book in prison because he wouldn't pay his taxes. Okay? That's how much he believed in it. So these guys are kind of an interesting group. Very much a get back to nature. Very much teaching that reason and basic human kindness will make everything okay. I love Henry David Thoreau's work. I would be a really bad transcendentalist because I think I would shoot first and ask questions later. But I like his thought process. If any of you are into that kind of stuff, go read the book called On Civil Disobedience. It's really, really good. But the single biggest factor in this time period, roughly the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, the single biggest factor is slavery. And there's a growing movement for abolitionism. The root word of abolition is abolish. That's the best way to remember this. If you're an abolitionist, you want to abolish slavery. And there's a lot of these guys that are famous, and we'll deal with them a lot more in the Civil War section, but let's talk about them. You have guys like William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was a white publisher of a newspaper, but he wrote a newspaper called The Liberator, where he preached on the liberation of black Americans. He believed slavery was illegal. Now, that does not mean he was not a racist. By today's standards, William Lloyd Garrison would definitely be a racist. Just didn't believe in slavery. He also did not believe that blacks and whites could live together. So what's the solution? What do you think? Any ideas? If you believe blacks and whites can't live together and slavery is illegal, what do you do? Well, his idea was, let's raise a lot of money, let's buy some land in Africa, and let's free the slaves and send them back. That's what he did. That land was named after the United States. It was called Liberia. Its capital city was named after President Monroe. It's Monrovia. This is the guy that helped raise the money for it. And it's still a country in Africa. It's a very unstable country that's been in constant civil war for the last 20 years anyway. And really almost constant civil war since its creation. But in the last 20 years has been terrible, terrible civil war. But that was his solution. Let's ship them all back to Africa. Then we got this guy, Frederick Douglass. I love Frederick Douglass. They called him the Lion of the South, and if you ever see his picture, he looks like a lion. He's got this, he's a black man with these large gray hair that sticks out on the side, looks like a mane on him. Big booming voice. Frederick Douglass is an interesting character. He was born a slave. I think the reason I like this guy is because he's going to make a lot of people angry, and I like that. But he was born a slave. Very, very sickly. Not capable of doing a lot of the work you would expect a slave to do. So instead of being put out as a field servant or being kept in the house as a house servant, they kind of just gave this sickly young slave to the master's son, kind of as a playmate or a toy. So he just hung out with the master's son as a playmate all day. Well, the master's son would go to school, and then he'd come home and he'd teach Frederick Douglass everything he learned that day at school. So Frederick Douglass learned to read and write that way. And as he got older, he worked his way up and became a house servant. Still wasn't quite big enough to do a man's work outside, but he could be a house servant. And he would sneak into the master of the house's library, and he had this book of great speeches called dialogues. And he would read these speeches and memorize them. This is what people used to do. Used to be, if you went to school in the 1800s, one of the things you would do is you'd memorize the great speeches of the past. And when it was your turn to give a speech, you would just try and mimic these things, try and sound as much like these as you could. Well, that's what he did. He memorized these. Eventually, he gets healthy, he's put out to work, and he escapes. Well, when he escapes, his master's furious, and his master puts out a notice, a reward for his return. Now, most people would quietly sneak off and not want to be noticed. But instead, Frederick Douglass follows the North Star, he gets up north. And while he's up north, he stumbles across this abolitionist meeting. And he stands up on the stage and he tells his own story. He's got this big, deep, booming voice. And people loved his voice. And he held up the poster of himself with the reward. And he flips it. He says, "This man has put a reward up for my life." Well, he don't own me. So if he can put a reward up for my life, I can put a reward up for his. And he flips it around and puts a reward up on his master's life as well. And he tells him, he says, "This is where I am. My name is Frederick Douglass. I'm an escaped slave from such and such plantation. And I'm going to be right here if you want to come get me." Nobody came to get him. Because he was brave enough to say that. He was brave enough to stand up and say, "I'll be right here. I'm waiting on you. But I got a reward on you too." I like him. I like Frederick Douglass. He ends up publishing a newspaper called the North Star, where he encouraged abolitionism. It's called the North Star, by the way, because you could get free if you got to Canada, and you'd follow the North Star to get there. So you follow the North Star. We know Harriet Tubman, sometimes called Moses Tubman. Harriet Tubman was the toughest little woman I ever heard of. She was a little tiny lady, about 4'11". She's little. She escaped from slavery. But instead of just staying up there in the north, she says, my people are still down there, and I'm going to go save them. So she used this underground railroad. By the way, that wasn't a real railroad. Somebody on their test every year writes down that they thought it was a train going underground. It wasn't. The Underground Railroad was just a collection of safe places, okay? She was a conductor on this railroad. She would go back down south. She sneaked back into the south, risking her own life, grab slaves, and escort them back up north to freedom. She freed hundreds of slaves in her life. There was one group she was never able to free. She was never able to free her own husband and children. She kept trying and never could get them out. Pretty sad story. I mentioned how tough this lady was. The story was that whenever you would get on the railroad with Harriet Tubman, with Moses, she had a big old gun with her, and she told you that once you start with us, you have to finish with us. And if you get scared along the way, I'll shoot you. Okay? Because if you make it part of the way through and then you go, I can't do this anymore, I'm going back, well, now you know where these safe places were, and you put everybody else in danger. It's better to kill you than it is to let all these people die. And she did it a few times. Okay? She's a tough broad. I love Harriet Tubman. I'm still mad that she's going to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill, but I do love Harriet Tubman. And then there's Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was an African-American poet. She was a slave. By the way, that was not her real name. That was the name that she chose for herself. To sojourn somewhere is to rest peacefully. So this literally means to rest peacefully in the truth. And she wrote poetry about how hard it was to be a slave and how hard it was to be a woman.
Teachers, pardon this interruption. When the bell rings, any juniors and seniors that are going with Miss Ford to Sam Houston, you need to meet her at the bus. Thank you.
So the most famous of these poems was called Ain't I a Woman? You might know that one. I'm sure you've read it or will read it in your English class at some point. You're not educated if you hadn't read Ain't I a Woman at some point in your life. All right, guys, I'm about to lose half my class, so I'm going to stop right here at this part. I'll post this up. All of your lecture notes are up online now. I've even posted the audio from the